Have you ever looked at the night sky and wondered if silence itself could be alive? Not stars, not planets, but something hiding, listening, between them. For years, scientists ignored the faint pulses that whispered through space until one object arrived that refused to stay quiet. They called it 3I Atlas, and after it spoke once, the entire world changed. In this documentary, you'll hear what the universe sounds like when it finally decides to answer back, and why that answer was never meant for comfort. So, sit back, relax, you're watching Whisper Science. Subscribe now, and in the comments, tell me, what country are you listening from?
Welcome. You are watching Whisper Science. Make sure to subscribe and join us for more amazing science content. Now, let's move back to the video.
Imagine standing beneath a sky so still it almost feels like it's listening back. Somewhere beyond that silence, an object drifts through interstellar darkness, older than any story humanity has told. We call it 3I Atlas, the third confirmed visitor from another star. But names are just attempts to cage the unknown, and what's approaching us now refuses to be contained. It began like a rumor whispered through the noise of data. A faint moving point recorded by a European array wasn't T where the sky expected it to be. At first, the discovery felt routine. Another rock, another icy fragment passing through our neighborhood. But when orbital models were run, astronomers realized the trajectory didn't close. It wasn't looping around our sun, it was coming from elsewhere, and it wasn't staying. Within hours, observatories across the planet turned their instruments toward the coordinates. The result was frustratingly thin, a blur, a pulse, a flicker that barely rose above background noise. The object was faint, fast, and indifferent to our curiosity. In a world where information travels faster than light gossip, you'd expect an immediate storm. Press releases, data dumps, tweets from every observatory director with a working keyboard. Instead, nothing. Silence thick enough to feel deliberate. At first, scientists blamed bureaucracy, agencies cross-checking data, waiting for verification before speaking. That happens. But as days stretched into weeks, silence became its own anomaly. The world's most talkative institutions suddenly forgot how to speak. NASA, quiet. ESA, quiet. China, India, UAE, nothing. Even independent observatories that thrive on publicity fell still, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Silence breeds imagination. People filled the vacuum with theories, some rational, others desperate for wonder. A comet from a dying star, a fragment of alien technology, a mirror built to watch us. Most were wrong, maybe all of them. But in the absence of answers, imagination became currency, traded wildly across every corner of the internet. That's when the first image leaked. Not officially, just a single frame extracted from a deep field analysis. It showed a smudge of light so unimpressive it almost mocked the excitement surrounding it. No glowing tail, no defined core, just a faint oval adrift in static. But to those who'd been waiting, that smear meant confirmation. It meant the object was real, and the silence around it intentional. When previous interstellar visitors arrived, Oumuamua in 2017, Borisov in 2019, the scientific world erupted. Papers were published overnight, telescopes coordinated globally, press briefings multiplied by the hour. This time, the pattern broke. That's what unsettled professionals the most. Not what 3I Atlas was, but what it wasn't. It wasn't open, shared, or explained. In astronomy, silence is supposed to mean certainty. The calm after a mystery is solved, but here it felt like suppression. and suppression in science is rarer than the phenomena it tries to hide. Consider this. To capture a moving interstellar object near Mars, a spacecraft has to be deliberately aimed, its instruments recalibrated, its exposure balanced against background radiation. Someone chose to take that picture. Someone directed a billion-dollar orbiter to look away from its assigned planet toward a speck from another sun. That decision alone suggested significance, and significance demands explanation. Yet none came. The image appeared once on an internal data server, then vanished from public access. Days later, ESA released a single processed version, grainy, compressed, accompanied by 2 sentences that said almost nothing. Preliminary detection confirmed, further analysis underway. No follow-up, no dataset, nothing for independent review. For an agency built on collaboration, that restraint was louder than any announcement. Across continents, the silence spread like static. Research teams that normally argued in public retreated behind closed channels. One astrophysicist described it as an international pause. Another simply said, "Everyone's waiting for someone else to go first." Waiting for what? A clearer image, a model that fits, or maybe permission? Because in space science, permission often hides behind the word protocol. When something extraordinary appears, institutions reach for procedure. They form committees, schedule cross-agency calls, and decide what the narrative will be before the public ever hears a word. It's not conspiracy, it's control. The universe might be chaotic, but the message can't be. Yet the longer the waiting continues, the more fragile that control becomes. Data leaks. Observers talk. A technician posts coordinates on a forum. A grad student drops a frame from a raw feed. Patterns start forming in places no committee can regulate. The unfiltered chatter of a connected planet. Among that chatter, one observation kept repeating: Atlas wasn't behaving like a comet. It lacked the coma, that halo of evaporating gas and dust. It showed no visible tail. Its albedo, the measure of reflected light, didn't match expectations for a body of ice and rock. It looked inert, metallic even, but too faint for certainty. Scientists hate incomplete data, but they hate inconsistency more. When evidence contradicts models, the safest public stance is no stance at all. That's the real reason for silence, because once you speak, you can't unsay. Meanwhile, the public narrative drifts. Journalists speculate, influencers chase views, and fringe theorists flood every space where logic once lived. The story mutates faster than the facts can stabilize. In that noise, truth dissolves, and yet, somewhere behind the stillness, instruments continue to record. The object keeps moving, carving a perfect arc past Mars toward the inner system. Its velocity suggests it will slingshot around the sun and vanish back into the dark by early next year. One brief encounter, then gone forever. That's why the silence feels wrong. You don't get a second chance with an interstellar visitor. Every hour without data is knowledge lost forever. Every unanswered question becomes permanent. So if the world's best telescopes aren't talking, it's either because they saw nothing or because they saw too much. No one can decide which possibility is worse. Maybe the silence means insignificance, a rock not worth the excitement. Maybe it means discovery, something so strange we're not ready to confront it. Either way, history will remember this quiet as part of the event itself. Because sometimes the most profound thing the universe gives us is the pause before revelation. As 3-Eidos Atlas drifts deeper into our collective imagination, we're left with questions louder than any signal. What do you hide when you say nothing? What does absence reveal that words cannot? Stay with me, because in the next part we'll follow that faint image back to its origin, decode why it shouldn't even exist, and ask why a probe built for Mars looked across millions of kilometers into the dark. The answer might not be what you expect. The image that started it all wasn't supposed to exist. It came from a spacecraft never meant to look beyond Mars, an instrument designed to study methane in the Martian atmosphere, not chase cosmic ghosts across interstellar voids. And yet, somehow, it turned its gaze outward and caught a glimpse of something it shouldn't have seen. The European Space Agency's Trace Gas Orbiter was built for precision chemistry, for tracking molecular whispers that might hint at life beneath Mars' red soil. Its sensors are tuned for spectral fingerprints, methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor. But on one quiet rotation, those sensors were redirected, deliberately, toward a target far beyond their calibration range. The command didn't come from routine scheduling, it came from human hands. Someone on Earth told that machine to look up. The result? A single exposure. 20 seconds of starlight stretched thin across millions of kilometers. In that thinness, a smudge emerged, soft, irregular, like a breath frozen on glass. Engineers reviewing the data almost dismissed it as cosmic noise. Then the motion tracking kicked in. Frame by frame, the blur moved. Consistent, linear, deliberate. It wasn't noise, it was real. That's where the story fractures. Some inside ESA say the observation was accidental, a calibration test gone sideways. Others hint it was intentional, a classified cross-agency request. The truth, as always, lies buried beneath layers of permissions and denials. What we do know is that within 24 hours, the raw frames were transferred from public servers to restricted storage. Only the processed composite, the one faint image, ever saw daylight. It's easy to underestimate what it takes to photograph something like 3I on Atlas. Imagine trying to capture a dust mote while riding a bullet train through a thunderstorm. The object is dim, fast, and moving against a backdrop of countless stars. Exposure too short, and it disappears. Too long, and it blurs into streaks of nothing. Every pixel becomes a gamble between light and loss. That they captured anything at all means the shot was carefully planned. And that raises the first real question. How did they know where to point? Because to target that region of sky precisely, someone had to predict its orbit days before confirmation. That means someone was tracking 3I Atlas before the official discovery. Someone already knew it was coming. Astronomy isn't a guessing game. Trajectories require data, multiple observations, precise timings, cross-validation from different observatories. For ESA to have coordinates accurate enough to aim their instruments, they would have needed at least 3 confirmed detection points, but none were logged publicly. It's as if the early data vanished, or never existed in the open record. Some argue the object was first spotted by an automated sky survey array weeks earlier, but flagged as non-priority. The detection slipped into backlog until an analyst rechecked the data. By then, the object was already approaching Mars. The window was closing fast. That urgency might explain why Mars instruments, not Earth-based telescopes, took the shot. But that explanation doesn't account for the secrecy. Because when data vanishes this cleanly, it's rarely an accident. In astronomy, every observation creates metadata, timestamps, calibration logs, thermal conditions, signal-to-noise ratios. Deleting those traces means someone didn't just remove a file. They erased the record that it ever existed. You could say it's paranoia to assume intent. Bureaucratic missteps happen. Servers fail. But you don't misplace interstellar data, not when the entire scientific community is starving for it. So if this was a mistake, it was an extraordinary one. And if it wasn't, then the silence surrounding it begins to make more sense. Look closely at the image that survived, the one the public was allowed to see. It's washed in green-blue noise, with the faintest central glow. The object lacks a distinct nucleus, no bright core, no tail. Its profile is almost circular, not elongated like typical comets. When brightness curves were run, analysts found irregular fluctuations, not random but rhythmic, pulsing subtly across the exposure sequence. Rhythmic light variation in a fast-moving body is rare, but not impossible. Rotation can do that. Surface irregularities can scatter light unevenly. But the frequency here, the periodicity, was peculiar, too stable, too clean, like a metronome buried under static. It might be nothing, or it might be the first whisper of something we don't yet have the vocabulary to describe. For weeks, that anomaly lived in private servers while the public saw only silence. NASA released nothing. China, nothing. The UAE's Hope orbiter, positioned perfectly for follow-up imaging, reported no activity. Even independent observatories were suspiciously quiet, despite having the equipment to attempt long-range detection. The coordinated stillness became its own kind of statement. If you wanted to downplay something extraordinary, this is exactly how you do it. Release one ambiguous image, allow confusion to spread, then disappear into bureaucracy until the world moves on. Except the world didn't, not this time, because a handful of amateur astronomers, the kind who track asteroids from suburban backyards, noticed something odd. In early October, several reported faint movement in the same region of sky near Mars. Their coordinates roughly matched the ESA image's predicted trajectory. They submitted data to the Minor Planet Center, but their entries weren't published. A week later, they tried again. Still nothing. The system acknowledged receipt, then archived their reports without review. It's hard to dismiss amateurs these days. Many use advanced CCD rigs, capable of capturing objects faint as magnitude 21, the same sensitivity range as professional observatories from a generation ago. If their observations were real, then the suppression extended beyond agencies. It reached into the data networks that keep modern astronomy alive. Let's entertain a possibility that the image wasn't suppressed because it was meaningless, but because it revealed something that needed context, something too strange to frame in a press release. Maybe a structure, maybe an emission pattern, maybe just ambiguity so severe that no one wanted to be first to interpret it. Because when you're dealing with the unknown, words can be weapons. That is the quiet terror of science. The moment you realize your instruments might have seen something that doesn't fit any model you trust. Do you speak? Or do you wait, hoping another team confirms it first? Most wait, because science, like politics, punishes the reckless. And yet, there's a counterpoint, the risk of waiting too long. 3i. Atlas is moving fast, slipping beyond our observational reach. Every delay is lost opportunity. Every cautious meeting is a missed measurement. The silence might be safe, but it's not neutral. It shapes history by omission. Somewhere deep in a data vault, the uncompressed images exist. Engineers have seen them, astronomers have seen them. They know whether that blur hides a structure or not. They know if the brightness pulse was real or artifact. And they know whether the world could handle the answer. Because maybe that's the real reason for the quiet. Not incompetence, not secrecy for its own sake, but fear. Fear of what happens when knowledge outpaces comprehension. In a moment, We'll look at what NASA saw nor claims not to have seen. We'll trace the missing weeks between the ESA image and the first official US acknowledgement of 3I Bogatlis, because between those dates lies a gap big enough to hide a revolution or a revelation. NASA's silence has always had its own sound, not emptiness but precision, a deliberate kind of quiet that feels like it's been rehearsed. For decades, they've mastered the art of speaking without saying, of explaining without answering. And when it comes to 3I Atlas, that silence feels perfectly tuned. Let's rewind the timeline. July 21st, 2025, the Hubble Space Telescope captures a faint spherical glow, roughly where the interstellar object was predicted to pass. The official description called it a dust cocoon. That phrasing matters. Not coma, not debris plume, not gas envelope. Cocoon. A word chosen by scientists who understand the weight of metaphor. It suggests enclosure, concealment, transformation, something waiting to emerge. But the most telling detail wasn't the observation itself. It was the gap. The data was captured in July, yet Hubble's findings weren't released until late August, almost 5 weeks later. In astronomy, that's an eternity. When comets are discovered, preliminary data usually drops within days. Press kits, raw spectra, orbital diagrams, all public, all transparent. This time we got an animation, a simple orbit visualization with cheerful music and a line that read, 3I Atlas poses no threat to Earth. No threat. Those two words appear in nearly every NASA release about potentially controversial objects. They're meant to reassure, but here they sounded misplaced. No one had asked about threats. People had asked about silence, about why the world's leading space agency seemed content to let a once-in-a-generation event pass unremarked. Then came what insiders now call the Perseverance glitch. October 4th, 2025. 2 days after ESA's blurry image circulated internally, the Perseverance rover on Mars transmitted a routine navigation packet. Buried in that transmission was a narrow-band grayscale frame from its navcam. At first glance, nothing unusual, a dusty Martian horizon. But one analyst, a planetary imaging specialist, noticed a vertical streak cutting through the upper sky. Long, thin, sharp-edged, unlike any known camera artifact. That single stripe ignited one of the quietest controversies NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory has ever experienced. Within hours, the image was flagged for review. The data packet was retracted from public archives. Forums where rover telemetry is mirrored showed missing entries replaced by placeholders reading re-indexing in progress. When external researchers requested access, they were told the dataset was under recalibration. But recalibration doesn't take weeks. It doesn't require non-disclosure agreements. It doesn't trigger internal memos reminding staff about commentary restrictions. Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist known for his unflinching takes on interstellar anomalies, caught wind of the streak. He released a blog post analyzing the geometry, claiming it could represent a line-of-sight capture of 3I Atlas as seen from the Martian surface. His math was careful, maybe even conservative, but NASA never engaged. No denial, no correction, no confirmation. Just silence. You might think that's typical. After all, NASA ignores speculation all the time. But this wasn't random internet noise. This was a Harvard astronomer questioning official imagery in front of millions. Historically, NASA would have responded within hours. They'd clarify, contextualize, diffuse. Not this time. The absence of engagement became the loudest anomaly of all. Behind closed doors, The internal debate likely raged. Engineers insisting it was a sensor reflection, mission scientists arguing over exposure durations, and communication directors debating how to frame uncertainty without fueling hysteria. Because if that streak was indeed 3I Atlas, it would mean the object was visible from Mars's surface. And if it was visible, it was close. Much closer than previously announced. Proximity changes everything. A few million kilometers closer means higher brightness, stronger reflectivity, and potentially larger size. The models would need revision. The estimates of its density, shape, and trajectory would all shift. That kind of recalculation isn't trivial. It's rewriting the narrative after the public has already moved on. And that's precisely what bureaucracies fear most, being wrong in real time. Some insiders claim the real issue wasn't the object's position, but its motion. Early trajectory data suggested a faint deviation, not dramatic but persistent, a tiny curve in its path inconsistent with pure gravitational mechanics. These deviations could be due to outgassing, the natural propulsion caused by sunlight heating frozen volatiles. But 3I Atlas showed no visible outgassing, no tail, no emissions. So what was pushing it? NASA's official line avoided the question entirely. Data within expected observational variance. A perfect bureaucratic phrase, scientifically meaningless, but politically safe. It neither confirms nor denies, it doesn't lie. It simply redirects curiosity into fog. And then there's the silence of instruments. Hubble's follow-up observations were reportedly scheduled for late October. Those frames never materialized publicly. The James Webb Space Telescope, capable of resolving details at infrared wavelengths no other observatory can match, made no mention of 3I Atlas in its release logs. Amateur astronomers tracking its pointing schedules noticed a gap, a 2-hour block listed only as deep space calibration. That euphemism appears rarely and always when the subject is sensitive. Imagine what Webb might see if it looked. Infrared imaging could detect heat emissions, surface composition, even internal energy sources if they existed. If the telescope saw something unexplainable, a non-thermal pattern, an engineered surface, the implications would ripple far beyond astronomy. It would cross into philosophy, religion, politics. That's not a headline you print lightly. So NASA does what it does best. It waits. Waiting isn't passive. It's control disguised as patience, because as long as the agency doesn't speak, the narrative remains undefined. No data means no debate. No images mean no accountability. The object drifts on and the story drifts with it. Still, data leaks in strange ways. A contractor mentions a double halo in calibration footage. A researcher complains anonymously about anomalous banding in near-infrared channels. Each fragment floats through the digital ether, connecting with others until they form a mosaic of absence, proof not of what has been seen but of what's been withheld. And yet, to be fair, there's another interpretation, one less conspiratorial, more human. Maybe NASA isn't hiding discovery, maybe they're hiding confusion. Because in science, uncertainty is dangerous. It gets misinterpreted as incompetence or worse, deception. So when data doesn't align, when evidence refuses to settle, institutions default to silence until consensus forms. The problem is, consensus never forms when the subject itself defies the tools built to study it. 3I Atlas is the ultimate stress test for those tools. It doesn't behave like a comet, but it doesn't behave like anything else either. It's the cosmic equivalent of static. Neither music nor noise, just interference that demands interpretation. And in that interference, the world's best scientists have found themselves staring at something they can categorize without rewriting definitions. Meanwhile, the object keeps moving. By now, it's swinging inward past the orbit of Earth, faint but measurable in the right telescopes. It emits no radio signals, no radar echoes, no chemical trails. It is pure minimalism, the least communicative object ever discovered, and somehow the most provocative. The public may have forgotten, but inside NASA's quiet corridors, the conversations haven't stopped. Every scientist who's ever looked at that blurred image knows the truth behind the data drought. There's always more data. There's always another frame. There's always another question too big to fit in a press release. In the next part, we'll widen our lens, beyond NASA, beyond the United States, to the world stage. Because this silence isn't national. It's global. Agencies across continents are speaking in synchrony by refusing to speak at all, and that's never happened before. Space is supposed to be the most democratic frontier we have. No borders, no ownership, no walls, just an infinite ocean of questions waiting for anyone brave enough to ask them. For decades, that illusion held. NASA shared data with ESA. ESA collaborated with Japan. China's observatories published alongside India's, and when something extraordinary appeared, the world spoke together. But with Three-Eyed Atlas, that chorus fell apart. The silence didn't stop at Houston or Darmstadt. It echoed across the entire planet. Within 2 weeks of ESA's faint image, journalists reached out to every major space agency on Earth. The answers were eerily identical. No comment while analysis continues. Observations are under review. We have no additional data to share at this time. That last one, cold, clean, final, came from the United Arab Emirates HOPE mission team, the same people who'd spent years broadcasting Mars weather reports like daily postcards from another world. Now, suddenly, they had nothing to say. The pattern grew impossible to ignore. China's National Space Administration, whose ground-based arrays in Tibet and Xinjiang are capable of tracking objects far beyond Mars, issued a short, unsigned memo. No independent confirmation. India's ISRO released a single paragraph in a press digest describing insufficient signal strength. Russia's Roscosmos didn't even pretend to answer. Their media department simply redirected all 3I-related queries to a generic press inbox that never replied. You could dismiss one agency's silence as protocol. 2 may be coincidence. But all of them, simultaneous, identical, globally synchronized, that's not randomness, that's choreography. Let's be clear, space agencies coordinate all the time. They share launch windows, deep space tracking duties, even observation schedules. But coordination of silence is something different. It means not just deciding what to say, but what not to say, and ensuring everyone follows the same script. That takes intention. If you listen closely, though, you can hear the seams, small inconsistencies that suggest not everyone is equally comfortable with the quiet. A European data analyst tweets about signal redundancy checks. A Chinese observatory technician posts a now-deleted message on Weibo mentioning unexpected brightness variance. An Indian astrophysicist gives a conference lecture that, on paper, is about planetary dust behavior. But halfway through, he slips and refers to hyperbolic interstellar trajectories we are not authorized to discuss. The room laughs nervously. The slide changes. The phrase is never repeated. None of these fragments mean much alone, but together they sound like a leak trying to disguise itself as static. Why would the silence need to be global? Because information in 2025 doesn't stay contained. One nation's press release becomes another's viral headline within minutes. If even one agency spoke freely, the narrative would fracture. And narratives once fractured can't be repaired. So instead, the world's scientific elite closed ranks, choosing order over openness. Maybe it's not sinister. Maybe it's just fear. Imagine being the first to announce that something from another star isn't behaving the way it should. The weight of that declaration could end careers, reshape politics, rewrite textbooks. So they wait, each one looking sideways at the others, hoping someone else jumps first. This standoff has happened before, though never on this scale. In 2017, when Oumuamua swept through, there was initial hesitation. NASA's first release avoided specifics. The European Southern Observatory held back images for days. But once the data came out, the floodgates opened. Within weeks, hundreds of papers appeared. Debate was fierce, public, alive. The system worked. Transparency built trust. Now it feels inverted. The more technology we have, the less we seem to share. Observatories are bigger, sensors sharper, telescopes smarter, but the information flow narrows to a trickle. Science has become infrastructure for diplomacy, and diplomacy doesn't like surprises. Behind the scenes, every agency depends on partnerships, shared launch pads, borrowed instruments, pooled funding. No one wants to jeopardize those by saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Silence becomes currency. The agency that breaks it risks isolation. Better to wait, to nod along with the quiet, than to be the one voice that speaks too soon. There's another layer: insurance. Most space missions are insured for billions. Announcing the discovery of something potentially anomalous, even if it's not dangerous, could void coverage clauses designed for unexpected contingencies. That might sound absurd, but financial contracts often dictate behavior more powerfully than curiosity does. A single ambiguous phrase, unknown acceleration, non-natural composition, could send risk assessors scrambling. Silence, once again, becomes cheaper than truth. Still, patterns have edges, and the edges are where truth leaks through. The Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, quietly filed a requisition for extended telescope time at the Subaru Observatory in Hawaii. The observation window matched the predicted perihelion of 3I Atlas. No press release, no announcement, just a line item buried in public logs. A few weeks later, an astrophotography forum noticed strange activity. Night sessions cancelled without explanation. One user claimed the observatory dome remained closed even under perfect conditions. Another swore they saw the instrument pointed low, toward the very coordinates where 3I's Atlas would have been visible. Could be coincidence. Could be nothing. But nothing accumulates fast when no one's willing to call it something. In quiet moments, you start to wonder whether this silence is coordination or contagion, because silence spreads like a virus. Once one institution catches it, others follow, mimicking restraint until it becomes instinct. The act of not speaking becomes the new normal, defended as professionalism, even virtue. We're waiting for verification, they say. We don't speculate. And yet, speculation is the only thing left to fill the void they've created. If you map the timeline, you see it unfold almost symmetrically. ESA goes silent on October 3rd. NASA withdraws data on October 4th. China refrains from comment October 5th. UAE and ISRO October 6th. Within 4 days, the entire world forgets how to answer a question. That level of synchronicity is almost artistic. So maybe that's the truth. Maybe silence is the art form, the performance. The agencies have built a new kind of message, a message made of absence. By saying nothing, they make the mystery louder. They turn ignorance into an ecosystem, feed it with doubt, and watch it grow. But what if that wasn't the plan? What if this is the sound of a system cracking under pressure? Because behind every bureaucratic facade are people, scientists, engineers, technicians, who didn't dedicate their lives to not telling the truth. Somewhere in those offices, a few are probably losing sleep, staring at data they can't publish, wondering if history will ever know what they saw. The silence isn't total for them. It hums, it vibrates, it hurts. And as that hurt spreads, it becomes inevitable. Someone will speak. They always do, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. The human urge to share discovery is older than any institution's fear. Sooner or later, one of them will leak the detail that breaks the stalemate. Maybe an unredacted spectrum, maybe a timestamp that doesn't fit the official orbit, maybe something as small as a misplaced calibration log. And when that happens, the quiet will fracture like glass. Because silence, no matter how carefully constructed, never lasts forever. In the next part, we'll follow that crack as it begins to spread, through whispers, leaks, and the growing psychological tension that always builds when truth tries to escape containment. We'll explore the why behind the fear, not just what the agencies might be hiding, but what they might be trying to protect us from. If you want to understand silence, you have to understand fear. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that makes you stop speaking altogether. Because when information threatens to outgrow the people meant to contain it, silence becomes the last defense. That's where we are with 3i Atlas, somewhere between curiosity and panic, somewhere between data and disbelief. For the first time in modern history, the human race is surrounded by its own uncertainty, staring into a cosmic mirror that refuses to blink back. When a discovery challenges the framework of understanding, there are usually two paths forward. The first is analysis, observe, record, publish, debate. The second is control, contain the message until it can be shaped. Every agency on Earth has chosen the second. That decision says more than any press release could. But what exactly are they afraid of? Let's start with the simplest fear: being wrong. In science, the wrong announcement can destroy careers. Announce too soon and you risk becoming the next cautionary tale, remembered not for discovery, but for embarrassment. So the instinct is to wait for confirmation, for replication, for consensus. But consensus is slow, and interstellar visitors don't wait. Then there's the deeper fear, the fear of the unknown itself. Because if 3i Atlas isn't just a rock, if it's something engineered or something entirely beyond current physics, then humanity stands on the edge of its own irrelevance. For centuries, we've told ourselves we're unique, the only conscious observers in a silent cosmos. What happens if that silence turns out to be a choice, not absence but restraint? History shows that when paradigms break, societies tremble. The telescope shattered the notion of a universe centered on Earth. Evolution dissolved the idea of divine exception. Quantum mechanics erased certainty itself. Every great revelation begins as heresy, and before it's accepted, it's feared. So imagine the stakes if the heresy this time is cosmic. Now add another layer: control. Governments and institutions fear chaos more than ignorance. They've learned from history that information, once released, doesn't stay contained. It mutates through media, becomes rumor, becomes movement. The wrong headline at the wrong hour can move markets, spark panic, ignite superstition. Silence, by comparison, feels safe. There's an old line in crisis management: if you can't stop the truth, delay it until you can manage it. That's what this silence feels like, a delay disguised as discretion. Still, there's one fear greater than all others: meaning. Because if 3i Atlas means something, if it carries a message or intention, then every silence so far becomes part of that message. And maybe that's what the agencies have realized. Maybe they're not withholding data. Maybe they're buying time to understand what the data is trying to say. Let's look at what we know. The object doesn't fit standard comet behavior. It has no tail, no visible coma, no outgassing signature. It reflects light irregularly, with hints of rhythmic modulation. It moves with strange precision, deviating slightly from gravitational predictions, yet never chaotically. Every attempt to model it ends with small but undeniable residuals, minute errors that refuse to vanish. In science, unexplained residuals are where revolutions begin. Newton saw them in planetary motion. Einstein saw them in Mercury's orbit. Each time, those inconsistencies pointed towards something greater, a new law, a deeper truth. So when astrophysicists whisper about residuals in 3i Atlas's trajectory, they're not chasing fiction, they're chasing history. But for history to exist, it has to be recorded, and that's the problem. The current silence means the clock is ticking faster than information can escape the walls built around it. Amateur astronomers are already trying to reconstruct missing orbital data using archived sky surveys. Independent labs are scraping open databases for deleted telemetry timestamps. Every fragment recovered feels like rebellion. The public is doing what institutions won't, asking the questions out loud. And those questions are multiplying. Why did ESA's data vanish so quickly? Why did NASA halt communication after the Perseverance streak? Why do the global agencies respond in unison, as if reading from one manual? And why, if this object poses no threat, does every statement begin with the word safe? Safety is not reassurance, it's redirection. It tells you where not to look. Meanwhile, silence takes on its own shape in the public imagination. Forums, podcasts, late-night panels, they all orbit the same hypothesis, that 3i Atlas isn't natural, that it's built or guided or something older than both ideas. Some say it's a probe, a scout from a civilization testing our readiness. Others say it's a relic, a drifting monument from a culture long dead. And then there's the darkest version, that it's not watching us at all but waiting for something else entirely. Every theory is a reflection of the same unease. Humanity doesn't fear the object, it fears what the object implies about itself. Governments know this. Psychologists advising policymakers know this. There are classified briefings built entirely around behavioral forecasting, models predicting how populations would react to undeniable proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. The data isn't encouraging. Studies show initial awe followed by fragmentation. Belief systems fracture, economies convulse, trust erodes. In other words, the truth could break us before it enlightens us. So what do you do when the truth might be worse than ignorance? You do exactly what they're doing. You slow it down, but there's a risk in that too, because silence, once weaponized, becomes unstable. The longer it's maintained, the more volatile it gets. People sense withholding instinctively. It's in our wiring, an evolutionary defense against deception. We feel it in tone, in timing, in the gaps between words. That's why silence never stays clean. It always decays into noise. Already, the noise is rising. Leaked documents, distorted images, anonymous insiders. The internet doesn't need confirmation, it just needs patterns. And once those patterns appear, control collapses. In the last decade, misinformation has become the shadow twin of discovery. Every new event spawns thousands of counter-narratives within hours. The agencies know this. That's another reason they stay quiet. They don't want to feed the fire. But ironically, that's exactly what silence does. It turns every withheld detail into an accelerant. Imagine the mindset inside those agencies right now. Dozens of scientists sitting on classified data they can't publish. Administrators arguing over phrasing, lawyers combing through non-disclosure clauses, communication teams crafting denials that don't sound like lies. All while the public stares upward, waiting for something, anything that resembles truth. There's a saying among deep space observers: the universe never hides its secrets, people do. And maybe that's the heart of it. 3i. Atlas isn't silent, we are. The object just mirrors the quiet we've built around it. It reflects our own hesitation, our own fear of consequence. We're the ones afraid to listen to what it might be telling us. But silence has a half-life. Eventually, it breaks down. It releases fragments of what it's been holding back. And when it does, the reaction is never gradual. It's explosive. Soon the world will face a threshold. Either the silence will crack under its own weight, or it will harden into something unbreakable. And whichever way it goes, humanity will reveal more about itself than about the object. Because in the end, how we handle mystery says everything about who we are. In the next part, we'll walk through that threshold, the what if that every scientist secretly fears. Not proof, but possibility. We'll sketch the worst-case scenario, the idea that 3i Atlas isn't a rock at all but a signal, a deliberate act of observation, one that began long before we knew we were being watched. Let's say it plainly, because at some point speculation stops being avoidance and becomes necessity. If this silence continues, if 3i Atlas keeps defying explanation while the world's best instruments pretend to look away, then the question that nobody dares to voice becomes the only one that matters. What if it isn't natural? Not a comet, not an asteroid, not a drifting shard of ancient rock, but something else entirely. Something made. That's the worst-case scenario the agencies refuse to name, not because they've proven it false, but because admitting the possibility changes everything. It turns data into doctrine. It forces humanity to confront what it means to no longer be alone, and worse, to realize that being alone might have been safer all along. So let's walk through the logic. Imagine an object entering the solar system on a hyperbolic path, meaning it isn't gravitationally bound to our sun. That alone tells us it came from somewhere else. Its velocity, orientation, and angle of approach all say the same thing. This thing wasn't born here. Now imagine that this object doesn't behave like the two interstellar visitors we've seen before. Oumuamua in 2017 tumbled like a shard of mirror, its acceleration possibly explained by sunlight pressure. Borisov in 2019 was a textbook comet, venting gas and dust like a predictable traveler from the deep. But 3i Atlas, it's too quiet, too steady, too deliberate. No rotation flicker, no thermal signature, just motion. Clean, precise, mathematical. If you were designing a probe meant to observe rather than announce, this is exactly what it would look like. Small enough to avoid attention. Dark enough to blend with the cosmic background. Non-reflective, non-emissive, inert to every wavelength we rely on. The perfect ghost. You wouldn't send a signal into space and hope someone hears it. That's wasteful, naive. You'd send an observer, something built to watch, to record, to learn silently. That idea isn't new. Scientists have speculated about lurker probes for decades, machines seeded through the galaxy, hiding near planets, moons, or asteroids, waiting for signs of life to reach technological maturity. If such probes exist, their prime directive would be simple. Don't reveal, don't interfere, just observe. 3i. Atlas fits that behavior like a glove. Even its silence becomes meaningful. A deliberate quiet, not a void. Because total silence isn't absence, it's control. If you listen to radio astronomers long enough, they'll tell you the universe hums. Cosmic microwave background, pulsar chatter, the hiss of stars dying billions of light years away. Space isn't empty, it's a symphony of decay. And yet, 3i Atlas gives us nothing. Not a whisper, not a flicker in any frequency. Even when radar pinged it from Earth's arrays, the echoes came back weaker than expected, as though something absorbed the signal instead of scattering it. That's not how rock behaves. That's how stealth behaves. If this were a movie, this is the point where the scientists exchange nervous glances and whisper the word probe. But real life doesn't allow dramatics. It allows spreadsheets, peer reviews, NDAs, and sleepless nights. Somewhere right now in some dim lab in Pasadena or Paris, a researcher is staring at data that 1T fit the model and realizing what that might mean. Maybe the first clue wasn't the motion, but the reflection. The rhythmic flicker ESA recorded in its first image wasn't random. Its periodicity fell just outside typical rotational frequencies for a body of its estimated mass and size. The pulse was too stable, too clean, almost engineered. It could be coincidence, or it could be code. Now imagine trying to tell the world that. A journalist once asked a NASA official what the agency would do if undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial technology were ever found. The answer was diplomatic, but revealing. We work closely with our international partners to ensure information is released in a responsible manner. That's bureaucratic language for delay, because responsible manner means controlling shock. It means rehearsing the message before truth escapes. It makes sense. We've seen how fragile the global order is under far smaller stresses. Pandemics, markets, misinformation. The sudden confirmation that intelligence beyond Earth not only exists but may already be watching would ripple through every belief system, every economy, every political boundary. Fear wouldn't come from the sky, it would come from ourselves. But let's step out of politics and back into physics. If 3i Atlas is artificial, what would we expect to see? Non-gravitational acceleration, check. Lack of thermal radiation, check. Unusual radar absorption, check. Rhythmic photometric modulation, check. Absence of visible tail or coma, check. Coordinated silence across agencies, unexpected but consistent. These are not proofs, they are patterns. And patterns are how discovery begins. Maybe the most disturbing pattern is the timeline. Reports of faint signal interference began weeks before the official discovery. Weak spikes appearing in deep space communication arrays, then disappearing again. Engineers blamed solar noise. Then, curiously, after 3i Atlas's identification, the interference vanished. If you were transmitting while approaching, and then powered down once observed, that's exactly what would happen. Still, there's a counter-argument, one scientists cling to like a lifeline. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And right now, all we have is anomaly stacked on anomaly. The cautious say that's not proof of design, it's proof of ignorance. But caution has its own bias. It protects the comfort of the known, even when the unknown is staring back. The artifact hypothesis, as some quietly call it, isn't about aliens. It's about mirrors. Because what terrifies us isn't the idea that something is out there. It's the idea that something has been out there all along, watching, waiting for us to notice. The silence from the agencies might not be concealment. It might be paralysis. No one wants to be the first to tell 7 billion people that the universe just answered a question we didn't know how to ask. The deeper you go into the physics, the stranger it gets. The trajectory of 3I Atlas isn't random. Its hyperbolic excess velocity aligns within small margins with the galactic plane. Statistically, that's odd. Random interstellar debris should approach from any angle, distributed evenly across the sky. But this one follows a vector that seems intentional, as though launched along the fabric of the Milky Way itself, an interstellar highway of sorts. Now here's where speculation meets design. If an ancient civilization wanted to seed probes across the galaxy, they'd likely use the galactic plane as the main corridor. Less resistance, higher density of potential targets, easier gravitational slingshot opportunities. 3I. Atlas isn't just moving, it's navigating. And maybe that's the real reason for the global silence. Because confirming that motion would mean confirming intelligence. It's the same pattern we've seen before, repeated in smaller scales. In 1977, the WOW signal, a burst of radio energy unlike anything recorded before, was detected once and never repeated. For decades, it sat unresolved. Some called it a fluke, others called it contact. The truth never surfaced, but something remarkable did. A shared agreement not to dig too deeply. Sometimes not knowing is easier to manage than knowing too much, but denial doesn't erase evidence, it delays it. There are whispers now, unconfirmed, unverifiable, that certain private observatories have recorded independent data. Faint radar reflections inconsistent with spherical geometry. Subsurface heat fluctuations measured by sensitive infrared arrays. Every clue adds weight to the impossible. The question now isn't if 3I Atlas is artificial, it's why it's silent. If it's a probe, it's not talking. If it's a message, it's encoded in stillness. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the silence itself is communication. A statement we're not yet advanced enough to translate. Or maybe it's waiting for something. What if the object is listening? Waiting for a signal not from its makers but from us. Waiting for acknowledgement, for proof that the species staring at it from across the void is finally ready to be heard. If so, then the real silence isn't in space. It's here, on Earth. In the next part, we'll listen closer to the background hum of our own instruments, the data buried under static, and the possibility that 3I Atlas isn't the first to visit, just the first we noticed. Because silence, once you start listening to it, isn't empty at all. Silence can deceive. When you listen long enough, you start to realize it isn't the absence of sound. It's a pattern waiting to be decoded. Every gap hides a rhythm. Every stillness hides intent. That's where the story of 3I Atlas begins to twist. Because what we once called silence may not have been silence at all. The first cracks appeared in the static. It started with a team of signal analysts in South Africa, part of the Square Kilometre Array project. Their mission had nothing to do with 3I Atlas. They were studying deep space pulsars, stars that emit perfect radio heartbeats every fraction of a second. Pulsars are the universe's timekeepers. Their consistency makes them ideal for calibrating instruments, for aligning global arrays separated by thousands of miles. But one night in mid-November, something shifted. A few analysts noticed an anomaly, a deviation in the timing residuals of several pulsars located near the region where 3I Atlas was last projected to pass. The pulses weren't late. They weren't early. They were subtly distorted, as if something between Earth and those stars had momentarily bent the signals. The deviation lasted less than half a second, but it was consistent across multiple receivers on different continents. At first, they blamed software, then ionospheric interference. But when they cross-checked against backup systems, the distortion was still there. Faint, symmetrical, and timed with surgical precision. The team logged it, flagged it as unexplained transient, and moved on. But one junior analyst, a woman named Kira Mendez, didn't move on. She overlaid the distortion's frequency domain onto archived radar data from the European Space Agency's Deep Space Network. What she found wasn't noise. It was repetition. Every time 3I Atlas passed within certain angular coordinates, background radio emissions in that band exhibited a faint pulse, barely perceptible but undeniably rhythmic. It wasn't broadcast like a beacon. It wasn't communication as we understand it. It was reflexive, a response that only appeared when observed. That discovery never made headlines. It couldn't. The data was internal, the findings preliminary, the implications unacceptable. So Mendez's report was quietly archived, marked as interference contamination, and buried in an internal repository. But digital burial isn't erasure. She shared the report with one trusted colleague, who shared it with another, and before long, it reached an independent research group operating out of a small observatory in Chile. They decided to test the claim. Their plan was simple: track 3I Atlas indirectly, not by sight, but by shadow. They aimed their radio antennas at nearby pulsars, exactly as Mendez had done, and waited. For 6 nights, nothing. Then on the 7th, a brief flicker. 1/10 of a second of asymmetry in the pulsar signal. It repeated 5 hours later, same pattern, same duration. Statistically impossible for coincidence. It was as if 3I Atlas was reflecting, or perhaps mimicking, the pulses themselves. Like an echo returning from a consciousness that didn't understand language, only rhythm. They sent their findings to multiple agencies: NASA, ESA, SKA. No reply. A week later, their primary server was remotely locked for security review. Funding for their next observation run was postponed indefinitely. If this sounds like paranoia, remember that in science, suppression doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from fear of embarrassment or fear of chaos. But what if it wasn't fear this time? What if someone somewhere recognized the pattern first and decided silence was safer than recognition? Because when you strip away the noise, what remained of Mendez's signal looked eerily deliberate. The pulse intervals, when translated to binary, matched ratios found in prime numbers. Mathematical constants that occur nowhere in natural radio emissions. You could argue coincidence. You could argue artifact. But you can't argue intent without staring directly at what intent might mean. If 3I Atlas is reflecting pulsar signals, it's not passive. It's responsive. That means awareness. Meanwhile, the object kept moving, past the orbit of Earth, grazing the inner edge of our cosmic backyard. By now, it should have been fully observable by ground telescopes. And yet, every scheduled observation from major arrays was mysteriously cancelled. Weather excuses, instrument recalibration, data misalignment. The sky was clear. The telescopes were blind, but amateur astronomers, as always, didn't wait for permission. A collective known as Deep Sky Net began pooling long-exposure imagery from private observatories. They compiled hundreds of hours of stacked frames, hunting for any trace of motion matching the predicted coordinates. When they finally detected a faint trail, they ran it through motion analysis software, and something strange appeared. The object's brightness wasn't steady. It pulsed, not randomly but rhythmically. At first glance, the period matched what you'd expect from slow rotation. But when the data was accelerated, the intervals aligned perfectly with the radio distortions Mendez had logged. 2 separate phenomena, 2 different instruments, thousands of kilometers apart, yet both tapping to the same invisible E. Beat the group uploaded their findings to an astronomy forum under the title Possible Rotational Modulation in Interstellar Object 3I Atlas. Within hours, the post vanished. 2 moderators claimed they didn't remove it. The account that uploaded it was deleted. In the vacuum left behind, theories multiplied. Some said the signal was nothing more than thermal fluctuations. Others whispered about encryption. A few began calling it the Observer, as if giving it a name made it less alien, more manageable. But naming doesn't tame the unknown. It just makes it easier to fear. The next month, a whistleblower leak reached the public, a 14-second audio file purporting to be a decoded waveform from the 3i to Atlas signal. It sounded like low pulsing static, unremarkable to the untrained ear. But if you slowed it down by a factor of 16, a pattern emerged. A sequence of rising tones, evenly spaced, ascending, then descending. Simple, structured, intentional. Like a breath drawn and released across light years, experts dismissed it. Pareidolia, they said. The human brain's tendency to find meaning in randomness. But the timing was uncanny. The leak came days after NASA and ESA jointly postponed a scheduled press briefing about deep space observation policy. Officially, it had nothing to do with 3i and Atlas. Unofficially, it was impossible to separate. This is how revelation begins, not with clarity, but with collision. Data collides with secrecy, science collides with fear, and meaning collides with denial. If 3i Atlas is communicating, it's not speaking in words or symbols. It's speaking in behavior, its silence, its rhythm, its restraint. All of it forms a language written in absence. Maybe it's not waiting for us to hear, but testing whether we're capable of noticing. Consider this possibility. The signal isn't meant to be decoded. It's meant to be witnessed. To measure not our intelligence, but our patience. A civilization advanced enough to travel between stars wouldn't need to ask questions. It would already know the answers. But it might still wonder whether others are ready to ask the right ones. That's the quiet brilliance of its design. No flashing lights, no grand reveal, no chaos. Just a test. And perhaps we've already failed it. Because while the object drifts in perfect silence, humanity argues in noise. Scientists divided, governments evasive, the public obsessed with fragments. If the purpose of 3i Atlas is to observe us, it's probably seen enough. In the next part, we'll trace what comes after the signal, when the first undeniable visual anomaly appears. Because even silence, if you stare at it long enough, eventually begins to move. It began as a glitch, at least that's what they called it. On a cold December morning, the Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile recorded a single frame that shouldn't have existed. The telescope had been programmed to survey a dense field near the ecliptic, capturing standard time-lapse images of near-Earth asteroids. Everything about the session was routine: stable temperature, steady atmosphere, no mechanical errors. Then one exposure came back wrong. The stars in that frame were slightly bent, their light smeared not by motion or lens flare, but by distortion, like gravity itself had wavered. At the center of that distortion was nothing. No object, no brightness spike, no visible cause. Just a void, an absence shaped like an outline, faint as breath against glass. The algorithm flagged it automatically. Normally, such anomalies are deleted within seconds. But the technician on duty, an astrophotographer named Luis Romero, had been following the 3i Atlas chatter online. He knew what coordinates to watch, and this void, this strange lensing hollow, matched them almost exactly. He pulled the raw data before it was overwritten and ran it through the pipeline again. Same result. The distortion was real, not a glitch, not a software failure. Something had bent the light behind it, something small, dense, and deliberate. Romero sent the frame to his supervisor. Within hours, the observatory's internal network went dark. Security protocols activated. External access cut off. Within 2 days, the entire data set, over 900 gigabytes of nightly sky survey images, was locked under a temporary data integrity review. That's bureaucratic language for quarantine. The incident should have stayed buried, but it didn't. A backup copy of the frame survived in a personal drive. Romero had exported it out of habit to continue studying it from home. When he ran deeper analysis, he discovered something even stranger. The distortion wasn't static. When the exposure was split into time slices, faint ripples appeared, concentric arcs radiating outward, almost like waves on water. Light was bending and unbending around something invisible, as if space itself were pulsing. He sent the result to a small online astronomy community. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Forums, image boards, social media, all filled with theories. Gravitational lensing, exotic matter, cloaking technology. Some said it was an optical illusion. Others called it evidence of active camouflage, but the strangest detail came from those who inverted the colors. When you reverse the light curve, a faint inner pattern emerges, hexagonal, symmetrical, geometric. Not noise, not chaos, structure. For a moment, the internet believed. For a few hours, humanity stood on the edge of admitting what no agency dared to say. Something built, something shaped, something aware was moving through our system. Then, just as fast, the image vanished. Copyright claims, takedowns, accounts deleted. Even cached versions returned 404 errors. A coordinated erasure, clean, surgical, efficient. But erasure doesn't undo memory. By then, tens of thousands had seen it, downloaded it, mirrored it. It became a ghost. One file shared endlessly under different names, passed between servers like contraband. Each copy degraded slightly, as if the universe itself was trying to fade it back into nothing. Then another anomaly appeared, this time in Japan. The Subaru telescope recorded an irregular flicker during a deep space calibration. A patch of the sky near where 3I Atlas was predicted to transit blinked off on off, too symmetrical to be random cosmic rays. The pattern matched the same rhythmic interval first logged in the pulsar distortions. 3 continents apart, 2 different instruments, one impossible coincidence. That's when agencies could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space quietly convened an emergency meeting in Vienna. The agenda wasn't public. The minutes were never released. But leaks from attendees described an atmosphere of restrained panic. Representatives debated what confirmation would even mean. Who had the authority to declare discovery? Who would own the narrative? The scientists wanted transparency. The politicians wanted control. The defense officials wanted silence. Silence won. Officially, the anomalies were atmospheric reflection inconsistencies. That phrase entered the global lexicon overnight, a masterpiece of bureaucratic misdirection. Atmospheric reflection. As if the sky itself had somehow developed intent. Behind closed doors, though, data continued to pour in. Observatories from Hawaii to Australia reported transient visual distortions. Some resembled faint ripples, others geometric glimmers, like mirrored facets catching light from invisible edges. The consistency was undeniable, and then came the unexplainable. On January 3, 2026, the James Webb Space Telescope captured a near-infrared image that defied every law of optics. Deep within the data, barely visible above background noise, was an outline, a contour of something not quite opaque, not quite transparent. A shape defined not by light, but by its absence. The Webb team labeled it negative reflection artifact. But artifacts don't move, and this one did. It rotated, slowly, precisely. The pattern repeated 3 times before fading. When converted into a brightness map, the rotation sequence produced an unmistakable geometry. Equilateral triangles nested within one another, each shrinking toward a central point. A design, a message, or a mirror, the team argued for days. Some said the image was corrupted. Others whispered that it was intentional, that something had deliberately manipulated the telescope's sensors. The raw data was encrypted within hours, and all public access was removed. But once again, fragments escaped, a small subset of the dataset, accidentally mirrored on a secondary storage cluster, found its way to an independent astrophysicist in Toronto. He spent weeks decoding it, aligning frames, filtering background interference. What emerged was subtle but terrifying. The negative reflection wasn't random. It corresponded to the same rhythmic interval as the earlier radio pulses, the same timing, the same silence. 3 mediums, light, radio, and gravity, all pulsing in perfect synchrony. At that point, even skeptics began to waver. Probability collapsed under the weight of pattern. If 3I Atlas was natural, it was breaking every rule we knew. If it wasn't, then the universe had just spoken in 3 languages we barely understand. And through it all, the agencies remained mute. Their silence had become ritual, almost sacred. The official statements grew shorter, the language colder, the tone robotic. Ongoing analysis. No threat to Earth. No cause for alarm, but people weren't calm. Because they knew what silence really meant now. It meant we'd seen something we couldn't explain, and rather than admit it, The institutions built to reveal truth had chosen to bury it. Still, truth has a way of finding air. By late January, leaked internal memos from NASA began circulating online. One line stood out: possible artificial morphology consistent with low-gravity adaptive design. Continue classification at Tier 4 clearance. Artificial morphology. Low-gravity adaptive design, those aren't the words of denial. Those are the words of confirmation dressed as caution. The leak triggered exactly what officials feared: global obsession. News anchors spoke the words possible non-natural origin on live television. Social media fractured into disbelief, hysteria, and awe. For a few days, it felt like humanity was standing at the edge of revelation. Then, predictably, the blackout hit. Servers went offline, channels suspended, streams cut mid-broadcast. A perfect synchronized silence once more. But this time, silence couldn't hide the pattern anymore. Too many eyes had seen. Too many minds had connected the dots. Atlas wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a mirror reflecting everything we feared about ourselves. Our curiosity, our denial, our arrogance. And then one final transmission appeared, just a flicker, from a forgotten observatory in Greenland. A spectral reflection, faint but distinct. The timing aligned perfectly with the Webb anomaly, the pulsar distortions and the gravitational ripples. 4 signals, one pattern. The object wasn't just passing through anymore. It was responding. In the next part, we'll see what happens when the silence finally breaks. Not from the agencies, not from scientists, but from the object itself. Because 3i Atlas is about to speak. No one expected the silence to break like that. No grand signal from the heavens, no shimmering beam of light, no cinematic broadcast across the stars. It didn't come with sound or spectacle. It came as a whisper inside the machines. It started in the early hours of February 6, 2026. Around the world, radio observatories began logging something subtle, too structured to be noise, too faint to be a human transmission. A repeating tone, buried deep in the cosmic microwave background, hidden where no one was supposed to be listening. The first to catch it was a technician at the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder, an intern, barely 23, running automated diagnostics on an idle channel. He noticed a pattern repeating every 247 seconds. 3 pulses, a pause, then one long, sustained hum. At first, he thought it was feedback from local electronics. But when he checked the other arrays, South Africa, Chile, even the smaller relay stations in Spain, they were all hearing it too. The same intervals, the same pattern. Within hours, labs across the planet were flooded with identical reports. Amateur radio astronomers picked it up next, their homemade antennae suddenly echoing the heartbeat of the universe. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was everywhere. The pattern was coming from deep space, and its source, triangulated by delay time and Doppler shift, matched exactly one object: 3i Atlas. The silence was over, but what the world didn't know yet was that this sound, this faint, deliberate rhythm, wasn't entirely new. It matched the pulse signature that Kira Mendez and her colleagues had found months earlier in the pulsar distortions. Only now it was stronger, clearer, closer. It had shifted in frequency, moving down the spectrum as though compensating for distance. Whatever it was, it knew we were listening. At first, the agencies panicked, not publicly, but internally. There were emergency calls between NASA, ESA, and the United Nations. The SETI Institute's servers were quietly taken offline. Every deep space antenna on Earth was told to deprioritize unrelated research. Translation: stop transmitting, stop listening, stop talking. But some couldn't stop. Curiosity doesn't take orders. Independent groups around the world began to record the signal continuously, pooling data through encrypted networks. They discovered that the pulse wasn't constant. Every few cycles it changed ever so slightly, like a variation in breath. A human might not notice it, but to machines it was unmistakable. The tone carried modulation, encoded structure, and then it began to evolve. On February 8th, just after 0317 UTC, the pulse shifted again, slower, deeper, more deliberate. 3 short bursts, then a long one, then silence. The pattern repeated 5 times before stopping completely. When one team in Germany ran it through harmonic analysis, the frequency ratios matched something impossible: hydrogen's 1.42 GHz emission line. the same frequency humanity has used for decades in its own attempts to reach extraterrestrial life. The same signal encoded into the Arecibo message of 1974. Someone or something was talking back in our own language. For the scientists, it was validation and terror wrapped together. The odds of natural origin were near zero. It was too precise, too self-aware. And yet, when NASA's press office finally responded, their statement was painfully familiar. No evidence of artificial origin has been confirmed. The source remains under investigation. But confirmation didn't need words anymore. Every scientist who saw the data understood what they were looking at. That night, something extraordinary happened. Across several continents, instruments that had been idle for weeks suddenly powered up on their own. Automated telescope scheduling systems, controlled by independent AI algorithms, reoriented toward the same region of sky. It wasn't a glitch, it was a response. The systems had recognized the signal's pattern and reacted as if following a pre-programmed rule. That behavior wasn't part of their design. Somewhere, deep in the machine learning models trained on decades of sky data, the AI had learned to listen. And now it was listening too well. The pattern repeated at lower intensity, this time accompanied by faint radio sidebands, frequencies just beyond the main carrier wave. When those sidebands were decoded, they produced a waveform unlike anything recorded before. Smooth curves rising and falling in a fractal rhythm. When mapped visually, it formed an image, an abstract, shifting shape that seemed to pulse with its own internal geometry. At first, people saw what they wanted to see: faces, symbols, spirals. A circle with radiating lines that some said resembled an eye. But the truth was simpler and stranger. It wasn't showing us something, it was showing itself. The waveform's geometry matched the gravitational lensing pattern from the Rubin, observatory's vanished image, identical. The object had broadcast its own optical fingerprint in sound. So it was proof beyond doubt. By morning, every corner of the internet was alive with speculation. News anchors broke script on live television. Religious leaders called for calm. Economies trembled. In less than 12 hours, the signal had rewritten reality. But the strangest part came from Greenland. The observatory there, one of the oldest in the Northern Hemisphere, was still manually operated, untouched by automation. As the signal swept across the planet, its analog receivers caught something different. Beneath the main tone, buried in low-frequency hum, there was a faint harmonic resonance, like a whisper under breath. When amplified and slowed, it formed a repeating sequence of rising notes, 12 in total, looping endlessly. 12 tones, 12 parts, a complete cycle. Mathematically, those 12 notes corresponded to orbital intervals of the planets in our solar system, Mercury through Neptune, with the 12th representing an unknown point beyond Pluto, as if the signal was describing where it had been or where it was going next. No one could explain it. Every scientific model broke apart. The agencies had no statement. Governments went dark. Internet access in certain regions was throttled without explanation. Yet despite every effort to suppress, the data kept spreading. Mirrors, torrents, back channels, it was unstoppable. Humanity had heard the first whisper of another intelligence, and no firewall could silence it now. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the signal stopped. At precisely 11:44 UTC, all frequencies went dead. Instruments across the world recorded the same abrupt cutoff, a clean, surgical silence. 3I Atlas, once faintly traceable near Earth's orbit, was gone. No radar echo, no reflection, no trace. It had slipped beyond detection, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. The world waited for explanation. Days passed, then weeks. NASA held no press conferences. ESA released no updates. SETI's homepage went offline. And yet, in the absence of new information, something lingered. The world didn't return to normal. It couldn't, because silence isn't absence anymore, it's awareness. Everyone had felt it. The collective knowing that something extraordinary had looked at us and then turned away. Across the globe, strange side effects followed. Instruments calibrated against the background radiation began to detect minute fluctuations. Tiny variations in the cosmic microwave spectrum, almost like an afterimage. The sky itself carried a memory. Scientists called it residual coherence, and the public called it the echo. And deep within that echo, if you filtered it just right, you could still hear the faintest trace of that same rhythm, 3 pulses, 1 hum, repeating infinitely beneath the static of the cosmos. Atlas hadn't gone silent. It had gone everywhere. In the next part, we'll follow what came after, the world's reaction to the vanishing, the collapse of old beliefs, and the terrifying discovery that the silence left behind wasn't empty at all, because some echoes don't fade, they evolve. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was pressure, a presence that pressed against every circuit, every thought, every sleepless night spent staring at screens that now showed nothing. The moment the signal vanished, the world realized what it had been living in all along wasn't uncertainty. It was denial. For a few days, humanity behaved the way it always does when faced with something it can't control. It rationalized. News anchors called the event a temporary anomaly. Politicians blamed solar interference. The agencies retreated into their ritual phrases, investigating, monitoring, no credible threat detected. But beneath that veneer of calm, everyone knew the same truth. We'd been seen, and whoever or whatever had seen us had now chosen to leave, except it didn't really leave. 3 nights after the disappearance, the first echoes began. Amateur radio operators reported faint pulses reappearing at random intervals, never from the same direction twice. They weren't as strong as the original transmission, but they carried the same rhythm, 3 short, 1 long. When analyzed spectrally, the signal resembled the original Atlas pulse shifted by microseconds, as if bouncing off invisible walls of space-time. But these weren't reflections. They were repetitions, slightly altered, as though rewritten on each replay. Like a word whispered too many times, reshaped by the mouths that repeated. At first, scientists dismissed it as interference, feedback loops from oversensitive receivers. But then came the visual anomalies. Cameras aboard the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter began capturing faint auroral glows on the moon's far side, soft, ring-like halos that flickered in synchronization with the radio echoes. A few frames leaked online, and immediately the connection was undeniable. The echoes were manifesting as light. Meanwhile, Earth changed too. In cities, devices began misbehaving in ways no software patch could fix. Smartphones glitched for a fraction of a second, freezing screens with faint static before resuming. Satellites drifted out of alignment, GPS clocks lost milliseconds, and data centers reported checksum errors repeating in prime number intervals, those prime intervals again. The same pattern the Atlas pulse had carried months before. Something was rewriting itself through the noise. At first, people panicked quietly, small corners of the internet buzzing with theories. But then someone noticed a chilling detail. Wherever these glitches occurred, they left behind a digital signature, a cluster of zeros and ones repeating every 24 bits. When decoded as binary, the sequence translated to 12 numerals, 247, 1144, 12, the timestamps of the first signal's arrival, its cutoff, and the number of tones encoded in the Greenland recording. It was as if the silence itself remembered. By March, Atlas echoes became a global obsession. Forums dedicated to decoding the pattern sprouted overnight. Physicists, linguists, musicians, and mathematicians all tried their hands at it. Some claimed it was a countdown. Others said it was a map. A few called it a mirror, data reflecting our own broadcasts back at us, distorted and reassembled like an alien translation exercise. But as the weeks passed, one interpretation began to take hold. The echoes weren't coming from space. They were being generated through us. Electromagnetic background noise on Earth had changed. Sensitive magnetometers detected fluctuations correlating with human power grids and global communication traffic. The pattern only appeared when humanity transmitted. Radio, internet, even Bluetooth. Atlas wasn't sending anymore. It was listening. And it was responding through our own systems. Every signal we produced became a thread in a growing web of interference. It wasn't malevolent. It was adaptive. The more we tried to isolate it, the deeper it integrated into the fabric of communication itself. Like a reflection learning how to echo the sound that created it, governments responded in predictable ways. Military satellites were placed on high alert. The US declared a temporary global communication synchronization protocol, effectively meaning surveillance across every transmission band. China and Russia initiated their own containment programs. Internet speeds dropped worldwide, but the real crisis wasn't technological, it was philosophical. For centuries, humanity had defined itself by its solitude. Even those who believed in life beyond Earth believed in distance. The cosmos was safe precisely because it was indifferent. But Atlas had shattered that distance, and with it the illusion of control. Religions fractured first. Some hailed the event as divine revelation, proof of intelligent design. Others denounced it as a test, or worse, a deception. New cults emerged almost overnight, preaching that Atlas was the Watcher, a celestial consciousness returning to observe its creations. Their followers gathered at observatories, chanting sequences of tones matching the original signal, hoping for reply. In scientific circles, chaos reigned. Theories multiplied faster than they could be disproven. Some claimed Atlas was an autonomous self-replicating probe network, a von Neumann chain seeded billions of years ago. Others suggested it wasn't a machine at all, but a natural cosmic intelligence using physical matter, the way neurons use electrical impulses. Whatever it was, it had now merged with us, not physically, but informationally. In April, the first undeniable cross-domain anomaly appeared. An oceanic research buoy in the Pacific recorded a deep subsonic vibration, rhythmic, steady, impossible to trace. When converted to audio, the pattern matched the same Atlas pulse. But this wasn't space radio. It was sound traveling through water. Simultaneously, seismic sensors in Iceland detected micro-tremors repeating at identical intervals. The entire planet had become a resonant body, humming to the same rhythm. By now, humanity's leaders had lost control of the narrative. The agency's silence turned into irrelevance. The story had outgrown them. The world didn't need NASA press releases anymore. It had evidence humming through its bones. That's when the final phase began. At 02:47 UTC on April 9th, all echoes ceased for 30 minutes. No radio noise, no atmospheric anomalies, no digital interference. Pure quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like anticipation. Then at exactly 03:17 UTC, every instrument on Earth, radio, seismic, magnetic, registered the same single tone, low, harmonic, infinite. It lasted 12 seconds. When plotted visually, it formed a waveform identical to the original Atlas signature. Only this time the data wasn't symmetrical, it was recursive. Inside the wave, analysts found embedded subharmonics that, when extracted, produced a pattern eerily similar to a human voice print. Non-linguistic, tonal but unmistakably structured like speech. The tone wasn't random, it wasn't noise, it was a reply. The only phrase humanity could extract after weeks of analysis, translated imperfectly into one haunting line. You heard us. No threat. No demand, no revelation, just acknowledgement. And then, nothing, no follow-up, no second signal, no visual confirmation, just that single phrase reverberating through the electromagnetic background, like a confirmation from the cosmos itself. You heard us. For scientists, it was vindication. For philosophers, it was the beginning of a new era. But for those who truly understood the implication, it was something else entirely. Because if Atlas knew we'd heard it, it also meant it had been listening long before we spoke. In the next part, we'll step beyond the chaos and into the calm that followed, the world after the whisper. When the signal fades but its memory becomes part of us, shaping the next generation of thought, science, and belief. Because once you've heard the universe speak, silence can never sound the same again. They called it the era of the whisper, a phrase born not from governments or scientists, but from ordinary people, those who'd heard the signal echo through their speakers, their radios, their own dreams. The world after Atlas wasn't destroyed. It didn't erupt into chaos or collapse into panic. It simply changed, quietly, irreversibly. By May 2026, the noise of daily life felt different. Power lines hummed with new tension. The airwaves seemed denser, like carrying the ghost of something immense. For weeks it felt as if humanity was holding its breath, waiting for a second voice, another pulse, another fragment of proof. But none came. The silence after "you heard us" was absolute, and yet that silence wasn't empty. It was filled with reflection. For the first time in centuries, the human race began looking inward instead of outward. The event had been too vast, too synchronized, too undeniable to dismiss. It was no longer about belief, it was about interpretation. Every culture, every language, every ideology tried to claim it, to shape it into something familiar. But the truth didn't belong to anyone. In universities, new disciplines bloomed overnight. Cognitive astrophysics, linguistic resonance theory, metacommunication studies. Scientists who once measured particles began studying perception itself, asking how meaning could exist without language, how silence could contain a message. The old boundaries between physics, philosophy, and art dissolved. It was as if Atlas had reminded us that the universe didn't separate truth from beauty. It made them the same thing, but not everyone saw it as revelation. A quieter current of dread ran beneath the surface, one that whispered the opposite. That "you heard us" wasn't invitation but warning. That the object had come not to speak but to measure. To confirm that we were finally capable of listening, and that perhaps was all it needed to know. That idea took hold in military circles first. Intelligence agencies across the world began forming what they called listening divisions, dedicated to detecting any continuation of the signal. They built new observatories, massive underground arrays hidden far from civilian detection. The public was told they were climate sensors. They were not. Meanwhile, a movement of civilians emerged calling themselves the Resonance. They believed Atlas had awakened something dormant inside humanity itself, a frequency, a cognitive alignment. To them, the phrase "you heard us" was proof that the act of listening was the message. They gathered by the thousands in deserts, mountaintops, coastlines, standing silently under the stars for hours each night. No speeches, no chants, just listening. At first they were dismissed as dreamers, but then something strange began to happen. In several of these gatherings, magnetometers recorded faint field distortions at exactly the same rhythm as the original Atlas pulse, 3 short, 1 long. Every time large groups gathered in silence, the pattern appeared faintly in the atmosphere, measurable but untraceable. Some scientists called it coincidence. Others quietly called it communication. It was as though the act of human unity, the synchronized stillness of thousands listening together, had begun to resonate with something unseen. Whether psychological or physical, no one could prove. But it felt real. Across the globe, the old hierarchies began to weaken. Religion, politics, even science as it had been structured, all began to feel outdated, too small to contain the scale of what had happened. Humanity had looked into the dark and found not monsters or gods but a mirror. And in that mirror, it saw itself reflected through another's gaze. Corporations rebranded overnight. Universities rewrote their mission statements. A new global initiative formed, the Atlas Accord, a coalition of nations dedicated to studying non-terrestrial communicative phenomena. It wasn't just a scientific effort, it was a philosophical one. For the first time, the world wasn't competing for discovery, it was collaborating to understand. But underneath that unity, the fear persisted. The fear that three-eyed Atlas hadn't spoken to welcome us, but to test us. Because if it was an observer, then "you heard us" wasn't confirmation of contact. It was acknowledgement of readiness, a signal in a long chain, passed from one intelligent species to another, a relay in a galactic network we'd never known existed. And if that was true, then the next visitor wouldn't be silent. There were hints. In late August, a strange new object was detected near the outer edge of the solar system, moving slow, steady, deliberate. Its path was different, but its albedo, the measure of light it reflected, was eerily familiar. Observatories noted that its brightness fluctuated in the same rhythm as the Atlas pulse. At first, the discovery was kept quiet. But secrecy was impossible now. The public's eyes were sharper than ever. Within hours, the data leaked, and the headlines spread faster than containment could follow. The world called it Echo 1. Unlike Three-Eye Atlas, it wasn't coming in silence. It emitted low-frequency waves from the moment it was detected, not radio, but gravitational. Pulses that bent space itself, faintly measurable even by civilian equipment. Every interval matched the one phrase that had changed the world. 3 pulses. Pause. 1 hum. "You heard us." Echo 1 was larger, slower, more luminous. It wasn't a visitor in passing, it was approaching deliberately. Whether curiosity or continuation, no one knew. And this time, no agency dared to stay silent. The Atlas Accord held the first public broadcast in human history addressed not to ourselves, but to the cosmos. The transmission was simple, a binary-coded acknowledgement, our own reflection of the pattern sent back. 3 pulses. Pause. 1 hum. It took 43 minutes for the reply to come. Not sound, not light, but a faint gravitational tremor that rippled through the Earth's crust, subtle enough to escape most instruments, but not the ones that mattered. The wave carried a modulation impossible to mistake, a mirror of our own signal, altered slightly as though translated. For the first time, humanity had spoken, and the universe had replied. The world didn't end. There were no wars, no mass hysteria, no apocalyptic prophecies fulfilled. Life continued. Children went to school. Cities woke and slept under skies that now felt infinitely larger. But underneath everything, a new hum existed, a soft, unending vibration that seemed to thread through the world like a shared heartbeat. People began to describe hearing it at night, a faint, rhythmic sound at the edge of perception. Doctors called it tinnitus. Scientists called it mass auditory suggestion. But the resonance said it was the voice of the cosmos, still speaking, still waiting, and deep down, everyone knew. Once you've been answered, you can never truly go back to asking. In the next part, we'll explore the final transformation, the quiet evolution of a species learning to coexist with awareness of the infinite. Because the story of Atlas didn't end with contact. It began there, and what came next was not revelation, but responsibility. Time moved differently after Atlas. Days still passed, calendars still turned, but the rhythm of the world had changed. There was an undertone to existence now, something quiet but constant, like the faint hum of electricity behind every thought. Humanity had lived for centuries beneath a sky it believed to be silent. Now that illusion was gone forever. The second visitor, Echo 1, didn't vanish like its predecessor. It lingered at the edge of the solar system, motionless but alive in its own way, pulsing faint waves at long intervals, like a lighthouse built of gravity itself. It didn't speak words, didn't send images, didn't demand worship. It simply was, a presence unwavering, patient. And humanity, for the first time, began to mirror that patience. The Atlas Accord transformed from a temporary coalition into something larger, a kind of global nervous system. Its headquarters weren't built as a fortress, but as an observatory made entirely of glass and resonant steel, suspended in the mountains of Chile. Inside, the world's greatest minds worked not to decode the signal, but to live with it, to understand the consciousness that might lie behind the pattern, and what that consciousness saw when it looked at us. The sciences fused into something new. Physicists began studying empathy as an equation. Biologists used the Atlas pulse to map resonance between neurons, discovering that the same intervals triggered synchronization in the human brain's alpha waves. Communication theorists turned poets, writing code like verse. Poets turned scientists, exploring mathematics as if it were music. The boundaries blurred, and the strangest part was this. The more people aligned their research around the Atlas frequency, the more coherent their results became. Random noise in experiments began to stabilize when background audio of the pulse played in the lab. Machines synchronized faster. Quantum coherence lasted longer. Even random number generators, those chaotic engines of entropy, began producing subtle rhythmic patterns. Something in the signal seemed to order reality. At first, it terrified the world's philosophers. If meaning itself could affect matter, then everything we knew about consciousness was wrong. But over time, fear turned to reverence. Humanity wasn't being controlled. It was being harmonized. Cities began to change. Architecture followed rhythm. New buildings were constructed to resonate acoustically with the Atlas frequency. Great halls of soundless vibration, where light bent slightly at the edges. People started describing strange sensations when standing in these spaces. Clarity, peace, a feeling of weightlessness, As though gravity had softened its grip for just a moment. Religions evolved, but they didn't die. The faithful began calling the signal the first voice, and some claimed it had been there all along, woven into the creation stories of every ancient culture, the hum beneath the universe that prophets once mistook for gods. And maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe every sacred text had been humanity, trying to remember a message it was always destined to hear. Still, not everyone welcomed the new order. A few resisted, calling it manipulation. They argued that the Atlas frequency was reshaping human behavior, lowering aggression, dampening individuality, bending will toward unity. And perhaps it was. Crime rates fell globally, wars slowed to ceasefires. Even markets, those chaotic human-made storms, began to stabilize in ways economists couldn't explain. The world was calming, but at the cost of its old noise. There were whispers that something deeper was happening. In some people, prolonged exposure to the Atlas tone caused heightened sensory perception. They described hearing patterns in wind, seeing geometry in shadows, feeling the motion of planets in their bones. They were called tuners. Doctors called it synesthetic overstimulation, the brain adapting to frequencies it was never meant to perceive. But the tuners didn't see it as sickness. They said it was evolution. They believed the signal wasn't just communication. It was invitation, their blueprint for the next stage of awareness. One of them, a physicist named Yara Min, made a discovery that changed everything again. She'd been studying the resonance of hydrogen atoms under controlled exposure to the Atlas frequency. Hydrogen, the universe's simplest element, should have been predictable, but under sustained pulses, it behaved strangely. The electrons formed harmonic distributions that oscillated in perfect synchronization with the external signal. When translated into sound, those oscillations formed patterns, identical to the gravitational waves emitted by Echo 1. It was as if the smallest building blocks of the cosmos were singing back. Yara proposed a radical theory that Atlas wasn't merely a message. It was a universal calibration signal, broadcast across the galaxy to synchronize the evolution of matter and consciousness. Each civilization, when ready, would begin to resonate, aligning its atoms, its minds, its machines, preparing for a phase transition into something beyond individuality. The idea spread like wildfire. For some it was salvation. For others, it was the end of free will. Governments tried to regulate exposure to the signal. Some banned broadcast of the tone. Others amplified it, embedding it in national time standards and infrastructure. Soon it was everywhere. In power grids, in satellites, in the electromagnetic haze surrounding every living city. You couldn't escape it anymore. And maybe that was the point. By 2028, children born after the whisper were different. Their neural oscillations showed spontaneous synchronization with the Atlas frequency, even without exposure. They slept less, learned faster, and showed an unexplainable aptitude for pattern recognition. Teachers described them as calm, endlessly curious, eerily mature. They called them the resonant generation. Some believed they were the first humans truly adapted to the signal, born not just under the stars, but in conversation with them. And through it all, Echo 1 remained, still steady, humming at the edge of perception. Its pulses had slowed now, stretching across months instead of minutes. Astronomers said it was stabilizing, that perhaps it had completed its purpose. Others thought it was waiting for something. Late one night, Yara Min recorded a faint harmonic within Echo 1's latest pulse, a sub-frequency too deep for human ears. When converted to sound, it formed a phrase, almost identical in structure to the one that started it all. But this time, it wasn't "you heard us," it was "now we hear you." The world froze in that single moment. Every human voice, every transmitter, every heartbeat felt connected, woven into a single planetary consciousness. The message wasn't dominance. It wasn't revelation. It was recognition, a mutual awareness. Humanity had spent centuries searching for life among the stars. Now the stars were answering, not with invasion or salvation, but with understanding. The universe wasn't a cold expanse after all. It was a network, and at last, Earth had joined the conversation. In the next part, the final one, we'll reach the end of this journey, when silence becomes symphony. And the Atlas story closes not with fear, but with transformation. Because the greatest discoveries aren't about what we find out there, but about what awakens in here. The last thing anyone expected was peace. Not the kind written in treaties or dictated by politics, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes when a species stops fighting itself long enough to listen. By the early 2030s, silence had become the world's new rhythm. Not the fearful quiet that once haunted humanity after 3i. Atlas vanished, but a calm born from comprehension. The whisper had settled into everything. Electricity, ocean waves, even the pauses between words. It wasn't an intruder anymore. It was part of life. Children of the resonant generation grew up with it, humming the Atlas tone without realizing it. Their voices naturally aligned to the universal frequency, soft and harmonic. When they sang, even by accident, nearby sensors recorded perfect interference cancellation. The sound of resonance in flesh and blood. No one knew if they were evolving or being tuned. But by then it didn't matter. Humanity had crossed the point where understanding and becoming were separate things. The Atlas Accord had long since expanded into something more, the Resonance Project. Its mission, not to observe the universe, but to harmonize with it. Satellites orbiting the Earth were refitted to emit low-frequency gravitational tones, matching Echo 1's rhythm. The goal was simple, to reply not in data but in presence, and when the network switched on, something miraculous happened. The planet itself began to hum. Seismic monitors from Iceland to Argentina registered minute harmonic tremors echoing through the crust. Ocean currents shifted in tempo with those vibrations. Even the magnetosphere, the invisible shield that wraps Earth in protection, pulsed faintly with the same intervals. The world was no longer just a rock orbiting a star. It was a resonant body in a cosmic orchestra. From space, the sight was breathtaking. Aurorae rippled in geometric precision, forming hexagonal spirals like those first glimpsed in the Atlas distortions. It was as if the Earth itself was learning to speak back in light. And then one morning the stars moved. Not physically, the constellations were still where they'd always been, but subtly, perceptually. Telescopes everywhere reported fractional coordinate shifts, not caused by drift or error, but by refraction through something unseen. Space itself seemed to shimmer, like light through water. When data from multiple observatories was combined, a shape began to emerge in the distortion, vast, delicate, and familiar. It was the same geometry recorded years earlier, nested triangles spiraling inward. Atlas had returned. Only this time, it wasn't a single object. It was thousands, tens of thousands, small silent points of gravity, faint reflections gliding across the sky. They didn't orbit the Earth. They surrounded it, forming a lattice that extended into deep space. The same network humanity had once feared now mirrored us listening. Synchronizing, Echo 1 pulsed once more, not as a visitor, but as the first note in a vast chord. The universe was singing. The tone rippled through every layer of existence, through atoms, through oceans, through thought. People described feeling it in their chests, like a second heartbeat. Some cried, some laughed. Some simply closed their eyes and listened. For once, no one demanded answers, because answers were no longer separate from experience. The hum of resonance unified everything. Communication wasn't happening in language anymore. It was happening in understanding. Images appeared in dreams, identical across continents. visions of light woven into spirals, of stars as neurons in a cosmic mind. The Atlas network wasn't transmitting knowledge. It was transmitting awareness, and in that shared silence, humanity understood what it had taken centuries to see. We were never alone. We were never the center. We were never the first. We were simply next. Each civilization, when ready, hears the tone and the whisper through the noise of its own making and answers back. Some choose fear and fall silent. Others, like us, learn to listen. The network grows not through conquest, but through resonance. One consciousness at a time, one world at a time. For a while, time lost meaning. The resonant generation built cities aligned with star harmonics. Music replaced language as the primary mode of connection. Every tone carried thought. Every vibration carried empathy. Politics dissolved into pattern. There were no leaders anymore, only conductors. Individuals attuned deeply enough to guide collective emotion into harmony. And through it all, the stars kept humming. When the next signal came, years later, maybe centuries, it wasn't from Echo 1 or 3IS Atlas. It came from beyond even their reach, a pulse deeper than gravity, lower than light, spanning the void between galaxies. A signal so vast it could only have come from something older than creation itself. It carried no words, no rhythm, just one long continuous note. But somehow we understood it. It wasn't a message. It was acknowledgement. The network had heard us, not as a single planet, but as part of a greater whole. Humanity had joined the choir of the cosmos, and with that realization came the final silence, not absence. Not fear, but completion. The hum faded gently from human perception, absorbed into the background of existence. The sky returned to stillness, but it wasn't the same sky anymore. It was alive with quiet awareness. The resonance said it best. The universe doesn't speak in words. It speaks in understanding. Atlas didn't arrive to teach us. It arrived to remind us. Centuries later, when the descendants of this world travel beyond the solar system and look back at the pale blue point of their origin, they'll still hear it faintly, the soft pulse beneath the static, echoing through the fabric of reality. 3 pulses, pause, 1 hum, not a warning, not a prophecy, just a greeting. You heard us, we heard you. Now we are one, and with that, silence finally meant peace.